Well, I know this sort of day was coming because now we have to move on to talking about a particularly hotbed of topic and controversy when it comes to Christian, and that are his enablers. Those sorts of people, the people that don't tell Chris the truth. They try and feed into his delusions. And by the way, can I just say before we even get anywhere started with this, there is a huge difference between not telling people the truth and saying things to make them feel better. However, here's as far as I work out. If people were to tell me, for example, the truth, they would just come out and say the truth. I'm openly encourage people to just straight up tell me the truth. And I'm not telling, but in terms of people who say stuff they want to make me feel better, usually what people do, from my experiences, they tell me, well, look at what you've done. Look at where you've come from. Look about exactly all you've managed to accomplish in this period. You should be very proud of that, and you shouldn't stop. You should. I know it may seem as though you want to slow down and stuff like that, but here's the thing: just take like 5 minutes. Just take a moment to think things over, and then go at it again. It's to remind people not to give up. It's not trying to tell people they're perfect, and if one person says no, then that must mean they are automatically in the wrong, or it's anything personal, which might be the case in terms of how we come to Chris. But let's just get straight to this. Enablers, or devotees of Chris Chan Sonichu, or docs as it's referred to as Chris has termed them, are those who encourage, quite openly, Chris's negative behavior and or self-destructive habits. Enablers can be divided into two main classes, the first being financial enablers throwing money at Chris, and the second being the fantasy enablers endorsing Chris's grandiose delusions. They are not necessarily limited to doing these. The overall characteristic that defines all enablers is that they perform an action with the sole purpose of encouraging Chris to live like a child, whether it be encouraging him not to be employed, providing him his most basic needs, role-playing with him, and much, much more. Some enablers and white knights fall into a subgroup referred to as anti-trolls, those who try to ward other trolls and Tetrad members away from Chris to have him for themselves. Those are not to be confused with counter-trolls, who primarily fight against trolls to protect Chris, rather to troll him themselves. Kind of a counterintuitive thing, because Chris is very, very determined about who he decides to listen to and, well, who he doesn't. Meanwhile, here's Helena Forenza, a fantasy enabler who feeds into Chris's delusions that Magi-chan is real. Well, used to. Because I've spoken to Helena myself on and off a couple of times in the last couple of months. Yeah, she doesn't do that sort of thing anymore because, well, because for reasons we'll get into. So, as you can see, there's a lot of things to cover, so let's start with gatekeeping. Gatekeeping refers to controlling access to Chris. It is used by trolls to prevent white knights and wannabe trolls from interfering, and by white knights to prevent trolls from contacting Chris. The Miscreants troll group, for example, actively inferred with white knight attempts to help Chris by deleting their emails before Chris could read them, or by manipulating Chris to believing the white knights were leaking information. The Watchmen, a white knight / enabler group, tried to gatekeep Chris from these trolls. In the case of Larry Vaughn, they pointed out Chris shouldn't interact with him, though Chris insisted. In the case of Jacob Sockness, however, they had Chris record Chris releases a statement regarding Jacob Sockness to discourage Sockness from completing his trip to see Chris. Fantasy enablers. Chris's grip on what is real and what is being fed to him was never that robust to begin with, and has eroded even further after years of being deliberately misled. It has wasted away so much to an extent that he is nearly incapable of distinguishing seemingly even what ideas come from his head and what came from others. Enablers exploit this fact by presenting Chris with their own invented information about the dimensional merge, or Chris's imaginary friends. validating his thoughts and convincing him that he is not alone. A prime example of this is Jacob Sockness, who used fictional dialogue between various characters, between Chris's characters and his own imaginary pantheon. Chris fully believed that this dialogue was legitimate, because of course he would, and expressed that he had heard it himself. Collectively, these enabler fabrications are known as the cult of the idea guys, for they had their root in the idea guys' example and have become the basis of Chris's religious beliefs. This Pseudos cult's name is meant to poke fun at how Chris had incorporated all of his beliefs and turned them into a religion, where followers worship him as their god, since the Idea Guys saga showed to everyone by mid-2018 that Chris really was this gullible. The go-to method for those trying to influence Chris has been to act as enablers of his delusions, replacing the previous method of posing as sweethearts. Yeah. Financial enablers. Besides sanctioning his belief in his own divinity, there is one other way that enablers have found in winning Chris over, through his wallet. Though his situation is not nearly as dire as during the financial crisis some years ago, Chris remains as irresponsible with money and adamant not to work as always. As a result, it is always precarious at best, providing him with the money he regularly requests, whether though lavishing him with expensive gifts, buying his overpriced shoddy merchandise, or donating monthly for comics he does not want to make, is a technique used by enablers who can afford it, such as Sarah and Steve, and even some who cannot, as Ali Hirschberg, to present themselves to Chris as being kindly and selfless, often in combination with worshipping and joining in his role-playing. Over the years, Chris has gotten thousands from his audience in the form of donations and considerations. He has received thousands more in sales through storefronts such as eBay and Etsy. As the notice on our homepage suggests, the Quickie strongly advises against giving Chris money. Yes, and that is a hill I'm willing to die on as well. Don't do it. He doesn't care, and he'll waste it. Because after well over 42... I'll say that after 42 years, you think the idea of financial responsibility would have occurred to Chris at some point roughly in his late teens and early 20s. Well, you would be very sorely mistaken. For example, a laptop computer from a Wien in North Carolina, date received August 2011. Chris spoke about it as in gratitude for a person in North Carolina. A common theory is that the laptop had been infected with a keylogger, but Chris outsmarted the Wien by upgrading the computer. Amount, $500 from Kiwi Farms, date received January 2014. Donated by fans after the house fire. Yeah, by the way, after all of that, the first thing Chris did is that he got in touch with Noel, who also attached a letter with the box of supplies and the $500 money order. And the first thing that Chris did was, "Hey, Dodo Brain, you did not sign the money, the shipment, the money order that came in the big box, and the bank is unable to do anything about it. And have it make out another thing." Yeah, basically, Chris's first impression was literally to scat and spit in the direction of Noel, like a cat on a wall. That's the reason why it's... Even as far back as 2014, people were very... Because despite the fact that Chris burned his own house down himself, well, by accident, but it was Chris who was the one who, you know, threw the spark and all that. $150 from fans, September 2014. From a Kickstarter campaign in which Chris explicitly stated he would use it to buy Legos. Why anybody would send as much as that, I couldn't tell you. $1,000 from D-Stex in September 2015, donated during the climax of his review series of Sonichu to fund the production of new pages for the comic. Chris used the money to buy a new bed, arguably one of his only sensible purchases in recent years, but then failed to keep his side of the deal for almost 2 years. Yeah, you're right, he literally, and he was called out on this, that he was commissioned. This isn't really so much like a donation, it's more of a commission order in any cases, but it's what it is. $500 from Sonic Rainboom, a Kiwi Farms user, also from September 2015. Chris was sent a Visa card with $500, later admitted doing it to get interesting content. And what it turned out is that Rainboom spent $500 to find that Chris liked McDonald's. Yeah, if you want to see what the receipt is for all this, it's literally just McDonald's, Super Center, Sheets. So I think there's like maybe a Sonic in here somewhere as well, but it's literally just McDonald's. And interestingly, CVS Pharmacy for $87. It may be argued that actually going to the pharmacy for like medication, maybe possibly for Bob, was also a smart idea, all things considered. It might have also been for the fact that Chris was pseudo going under reassignment treatment. Well, pseudo is the word I'd use. Hundreds, mostly weans, summer of 2016. During the financial crisis, a pattern formed of Chris begging for money, then briefly stating that he had received donations before begging for some money. Yeah, the basis for this are not necessarily clear, but however, Chris seemed to be going back and forth on, did he need money? Well, if he did, then why was he spending on it on extortionate prices for Legos on eBay? So, a lot of people are not particularly impressed, both before and after, when Chris was just throwing money left, right, and centre and basically crying wolf. $2,650 from selling the relics of Fail. August 2016 onwards, which included a Megatron, Chris selling his Megatron pistol, the Sonic Totem, the Pokewalker of Fail, and the She Came for Quick.jpg image, which $50, $1,500, $100, and $1,000 as part of a set. Then there was also $4,816.43 from Patreon, which started December 2016 to August of 2021. So 4.5 years. Chris earned pledges from fans and weens every month, and Chris very rarely updated his Patreon. So basically, this was, if in theory, even if you were to donate, let's say, $4.81 a month to Chris, that would be $4.81 you would never be seeing again. And Chris didn't particularly seem that bothered or cared that great deal, because by the time Chris's Patreon was shut down, it was somewhere close to about 500 whole days Chris went without actually updating his Patreon to meet his paid obligations. Because Chris will literally do anything to avoid work. Something that probably enablers should have seen the writing on the wall. $1,000 from selling binders of old Pokemon and UFS cards, January 2018 to 2019. 4 binders of cards, at least one was purchased by a seller hoping to resell the individual cards. $100 from selling a stained page of Sonichu issue 14, which from February 2018, which literally is just selling his old trash. And this isn't even one of those, one man's trash and all that. No, this is Chris literally just selling his garbage for pennies. $1,300 from Jack Jankowski, April 2018. Jack gave Chris $1,200 for a luxury trip to the 2018 BronyCon in the hopes that he would get to meet him there. Chris thanked him for the money in I have been paid, so we'll go to see, seriously to be determined. Jack also paid $100 for a video, which Chris decided to bookend with unrelated begging announcements. I'm sure Jack must have been absolutely frothing at the mouth at something like that. $1,000 from Miss Cherry in July of 2018. Tried the pay-to-play method to being Chris's next sweetheart and failed, and blew $1,000 in the process. And I don't even remember if the guard dogs or the watchmen were even involved during this period. Well, certainly not what they were trying to do here. It's about $391 from Ali Hirschberg in the summer of 2018. It's about 3 hours wages for me. I don't mind spending that on some Christery. During summer of 2018, an anonymous VRS Davison said in YouTube's comment section that she decided to spend $200 to buy an old blanket from Bob on eBay because she somehow considered it a piece of Christery. It evidently was not enough to pay a ridiculous sum of money for one blanket, as when Barb put more blankets up for sale. VRS Davison purchased another one for $100 plus $25 shipping. In October 2019, Ali Hirschberg revealed that she purchased them through a US proxy. In November 2019, she paid for a 41 set of Twilight Sparkle's secret chipfic folder cards and gave $50 for a Magi-chan medallion. $500 from Jill Duncan of February 2019. Jill Duncan pledged $500 per month to Chris's Patreon. Quite generous. Asking to speak to Chris. Then cancelled the pledge 10 days later, but because Chris's Patreon account is set to upfront payments, Chris still got the initial $500 and used it to purchase a replacement Xbox. Why, I don't know. Yes, an Xbox, when you have a mortgage to pay as well. There is no indication Chris ever spoke to Jill as she requested. $400 from Sarah and Steve, spring 2019. They bought Chris a Nintendo Switch, which cost $300, and gave him $100 on Patreon. Also claiming to have funded a room for hire at the 2019 BronyCon, which was $600, but pulled it due to Chris not paying attention to them. Yeah, and by the way, the Switch that Chris opened in a video, and Chris also got a small little purse as well from Sarah and Steve. Despite the fact that this happened and all that, Chris opened the video without looking really ecstatic or even saying thank you for what he'd just been given for nothing. That's kind of always been a bit of a universal issue as well for Chris as well, is that as the years have gone by, his ego, he has not become more humble, he's become even more egotistical because it doesn't cost anything to say thank you and stuff like that. I'm sure that he could have kept a lot more doors open if he had actually changed, because he knew he probably had no choice. But Chris is one of those people where he believes the idea that, beggars can be choosers as well, not the other way around. Minus $2,000 from Joseph Draft in April of 2019. According to the creator of the Chris Chan, A Comprehensive History documentary, which would be Gino Samuel, who was approached by Draft before the now infamous trailer was relisted, in order to get footage for a documentary, he had paid Chris and Barb an undisclosed amount, assuming that the Kickstarter was meant to cover the costs already made. The budgeted $2,000 as payment for the collaborators is the maximum amount Chris and Barb could have been given, from the information available. $200 from David 906379747, commissioned in May of 2019, was commissioned Chris via Twitter for a Solitude medallion, selling out $200 in order to get Chris's attention. Medallions were $30 each when Chris sold them on eBay in 2014. Became a Twitter white knight for Chris until Chris mass blocked some perceived trolls, including David. That must have... Yeah. Paying all that much and then Chris just blocks you no matter what. So that's like... Yeah, Chris will screw over the people who will actually try and defend him as well. That's nuts. $600 from a BronyCon donor of July 2019. After Chris repeatedly begged on Twitter for $600 to fund a hotel room after his previous plan fell through with Sarah and Steve, who had ghosted him earlier because Chris kept ignoring them, a fan just donated to Chris. But still, $600, that's like nearly working 8 whole days. For me, that's like nearly working 8 whole days for nothing. And I'm not about that. Why Chris couldn't get off his arse and actually go to work and, bring that amount home himself is a good point. $190 from Luke in October of 2020. A fan from Pennsylvania named Luke paid Chris $190 to autograph a variety of items which he intended to resell for profit. Chris delivered the signed goods to Luke's house personally. Then we have Unknown Bioweens from August 2021 to March of 2023. Various fans have been making donations to Chris while in jail. Chris claims that he used this money to pay back the remainder of the $750 he stole from Barbara when he was forced out of his house in July of 2021, as well as to buy numerous items from the jail's commissary shop. These included clothing, toiletries, writing materials, radio batteries, 2 Turkish prayer rugs, and numerous soft drinks and food items. Chris estimated his jail expenses to be about $50 per week. In the jail call from November 1st, Chris makes reference to one particularly generous donation he had received. Total, from what he had received from as far back as 2011 to what we know, $17,806.43. Meaning that Chris received, without having actually to really properly work, nearly, from what I could work out, nearly 8.5 months of me going to work, and he received that in the span of 10 years. You know, if it's, again, a kind of a shame, really, because when you think about it, like, you really begin to think about this, Chris maybe possibly could have added a 0 onto the end of this. And Chris could have been making nearly over $100,000 in like 14 odd years. But he didn't, because he had really no leisure or desire for it. Because if he did, he would have just got on with it. Maybe the idea that Chris didn't really believe in himself, or he was just too lazy to even consider the notion, is one and another, I suppose. Motives for enabling Chris. There are several motives people make for enabling Chris. These include the following. To profit off of the community surrounding Chris, many of these enablers are opportunistic hacks who aim to use Chris's platform to launch their career. These people do not have the talent required to make anything worthwhile and bait Chris into talking about them to help launch their career. A recent enabler, Ben Saint, badly attempted to develop a saga of his own within Christree by copying what Alec Benson Leary did, which was to promote his own media and make money off of the fools who would buy that stuff. To do this, he fed into Chris's delusions and added some of his own characters into the Sonichu comics. Joining the creative communities surrounding Chris. Never a good idea. Pro tip. Nobody is stopping you from making fan media. If you want to, then by all means do so, but just try to make sure Chris himself doesn't see it. Observers of Chris often include people who enjoy drawing, animation, fanfic writing, cosplay, and the like as a hobby. While many will post their artwork at places strictly for discussing Chris, such as the Kiwi Farms or Reddit, to keep their distance from Chris, enablers approach Chris directly with their fan art on Twitter or Discord, with the intent of seeking his opinion. Despite knowing full well he has issues distinguishing reality from fantasy, and will interpret their artwork as it is happening literally over time, these enablers built up a community for sharing their artwork, with the side effect of affirming Chris's fantasies. Attention whores. Some of these enablers desperately seek attention, and approve from Chris is something they crave for the most. They want attention, and they obviously don't get it that at home. So the Quickie is the next best alternative to get it. People such as MKR Nightv, Helena Forenza, Jacob Sockness, Sarah and Steve, and Richard Righteous come under this category. They often ardently defend Chris's beliefs about being an all-powerful goddess and getting into lengthy arguments with others over their actions. To make Chris produce content artificially. For most people, it would be utterly despicable to manipulate someone as mentally ill as Chris, let alone so that he can become a means for their enjoyment. For the enablers with more spiteful intents in mind, they would argue that the reason they are further deluding Chris is because it would encourage him to provide more content. They would tell Chris all kinds of nonsensical stories just so that he can act like their own personal lolcow to laugh at. I'm just supporting him/her/them. Eshel, seen here donating $10 to Chris, shows all the hallmarks of enabler. in that they pretend to be a fan and hope their financial donations will make Chris do what they want. In reality, Chris is most likely using their cash to buy video games. Actually, while we're on this subject, just a quick timeout here. I remember 53 weeks ago, it was a Sunday night, and I was heading home from work on the bus. How many of you guys have ever watched a YouTuber called Tactical Bacon Productions? He's now onto 100,000 subscribers. He mostly does video game essays and content revolving around Twisted Metal, God of War, and just some little odd topic of the day and stuff like that. And I donated $5 to his ranking every God of War weapon ranked from worst to best, mostly because I was in a very good mood and I felt quite charitable on that sort of day, and I donated him $5 saying thank you so much for all your hard work. And well, I kind of felt glad and proud that I did that, because it was a really good video and all that, and it obviously took him a while to make, so I just decided it was just the done thing, if that makes sense. And by the way, I do that for someone who actively puts a lot of time and effort into the things that they do, and their community is growing day by day. So that's the sort of thing I don't have an issue with, because I do it myself. I do, however, take issue with people who just, they know fine well Chris just sits on his arse. This argument is most common among the more white knight or social justice oriented crowd. Those who take this approach see Chris as a victim of the alt-right trolls, or whatever villain of the week has been created to oppress them. As such, to them, Chris is a beautiful, unique creature who is to be coddled and praised, regardless of the merit of said praise. Often this praise will be sycophantic in nature, with constant praise of Chris's artistic ability. I mean, I can't find it, but there you are. And creative genius. Another common narrative is that Chris is a grown adult who is perfectly capable of taking care of himself. No, he isn't. Easily separating the wheat from the chaff in regardless to orbiters. We'll let you decide how competent he is. Well, as competent as somebody who lets his house burn down, pepper sprays somebody over the colour of a character's arms, and then brags about having sex with his own mother could possibly be. So, no, I don't think so. To protect him from other enablers. Some enablers have already realised that it is impossible to communicate to Chris unless they can entertain his beliefs. So they attempt to assist Chris by, at first, playing into his own fantasies, and then subsequently attempting to dismantle those fantasies from the inside, or encourage less harmful ones. However, attempts at doing so have mostly failed. Arguments against enabling Chris, and there are quite a number of these. Whether you intend to help Chris or not, make him fall further into his delusions, or attempt to pull a liquid Chris on him by playing along with his delusions, there are a handful of reasons for why enabling Chris generally is not considered a good idea by most people. 1. Enabling Chris gives him a motive to never change. It goes without saying, but if one's beliefs are confirmed all of the time by the people that surround them, they have very little reason to change the way they are. This kind of helping Chris is what made him so egocentric and puerile in the first place, and that was when it was just his parents enabling him. Even if you do have good intentions and a genuine desire to help Chris, this way of helping is ironically one of the most harmful things you can do to him, by reinforcing the delusional state of a mentally ill person. You are doing nothing but unintentionally making their life worse. On one hand, fantasy enablers will play into Chris's desire to relive his childhood. On the other hand, financial enablers will constantly donate him money out of guilt. The actions from both groups combined have made Chris deny any sort of adult responsibilities, because it made him believe that he can sit on his ass all day daydreaming, as other people provide his basic needs for him. The impact of the idea, guys, has been catastrophic to both Chris's mental state and the Sonichu universe. In recent years, Chris's mental state has deteriorated from fantasy-prone escapism to complete detachment from reality. Chris has become so delusional that he believes he is married to several Sonic recolors and a Pokemon as part of a polyamorous marriage, is a goddess with psychic powers, and is worshipped by millions as their lord and savior. By indulging Chris, that is, encouraging a 42-year-old man to believe he is really a deity and anime character after he was tricked into thinking that, in the first place, you are only making things worse, and even helping to perpetuate the idea guy's machinations. When a person has deluded themselves into a belief that is potentially harmful to themselves and others, the best thing to do is not to reinforce said delusion, but rather to get the person professional help. Telling him that others agree with his nonsense only causes him to become even further detached from the real world than he already is. Agreeing with Chris that he is the holy patroness of a computer from the 80s, and that cartoon characters will soon start showing up in the real world, has also proven a prerequisite to interacting with him for any extended period of time. Even if you do not intend to indulge in his fantasies, you cannot interact with him normally to undo any of the damage done by enablers. The guard dogs, who originally intended to keep Chris from getting manipulated again, also needed to play along by alleging that Chris's amethyst ring was causing psychic chaos to gain their position over him. Most who are willing to play along with Chris in this way would justify their actions to third parties by professing they are doing this to help Chris in the end. Unfortunately, despite their efforts, Chris had refused to cooperate with them any further, and decided to go back to his fantasy world and continue falling for their other enablers, no matter what they said or did to him. Rarely does interacting with him yourself to tell him about your world clashing with his create the same effect as him getting angry over a minor character design alteration, or getting irrationally mad at a non-existent enemy. In the past, some of the best Chris content has come from his own head and actions. Most of the time, he is not even bothered by it anymore, seeing it as another happenstance in the world he created for himself. This proves that by enabling Chris, you are doing the exact opposite of what triggers the best of Chris by giving him what he wants or further confirming him and lulling him into a sense of complacency where he is less likely to produce anything meaningful and or entertaining content. Chris will always try to get what he wants, whether or not it is good for him. To add salt to an open wound, Chris has previously stated that trolling efforts from people like the Teen T Squad do not faze him at all, purely because they agreed with his views and were polite to him. Therefore, it would be insane to even think that trolling Chris in this fashion would get a laugh out of anyone. Chris also no longer believes in basic scientific principles, especially in the biology department, and already believes himself, and presumably himself alone, to completely understand the difference between what is real and what is fictional. He believes that all diseases are as a result of extreme stress, and that by being physically connected to a virus, he can completely obliterate whatever ails him. For example, when Chris got a cold in December of 2019, he believed that the primary reason was this due to how he was triggered by the redesigns of his Sonichu characters by Project SNT. If Chris gets inflicted with a disease, he will tell himself that said illness simply arose from his emotions and disturbances from other dimensions, as opposed to acknowledging he's ill and taking steps to help himself. To continuously try and enable him with these beliefs, Chris gets put at risk of suffering even worse ailments, without the proper care of treatment. Thus, when you enable Chris's delusions, you are directly putting his life in danger. The knowledge gap between you and Chris. Since the very beginning, Chris has had difficulties in empathizing with other people, or seeing things from their point of view. This especially holds true today. Where he has become absorbed within his fantasy land, some fantasy enablers, particularly in the artist community, might believe that they are not doing any harm by drawing fan art or fan comics that Chris likes. However, These people are fully aware that what they draw is simply fiction. Chris is not. Chris doesn't care about your fan art the way you think he would. He now sees it as evidence he can use to confirm his beliefs about the universe. Directly giving Chris fan art encourages his retreat from reality, as he then spends time astral projecting to the dimension he believes the artwork depicts instead of working on improving his real-world life. There is nothing inherently wrong with creating fan art of Sonichu or Sonichu characters. However, doing things such as creating a persona on Twitter, aggressively pushing your art onto Chris, and role-playing with him as your character does make it highly likely that Chris will use the art as an excuse to recede deeper into his fantasy world. Getting sucked into drama surrounding Chris. The time and energy spent on getting sucked into drama just to see who can influence Chris the most is one of the classic signs of enabling. Because of how trolling Chris is the one-way ticket to fame for some, and due to the amount of people going by the Idea Guys techniques, there have been a constant power struggle between groups of enablers vying for Chris's attention. Enablers have been trying to ward off from one another in order to reign supreme. An example is a group with Jacob Sockness and Sarah and Steve clashing against a group with MKR Nightv and Aqua Diamond 8. Sockness, perceiving MKR Nightv as a barrier to his schemes, embarked on a smear campaign maligning her to Chris and nearly succeeded. MKR Nightv found herself in the precarious position of both doubling down on her alliance to Chris's beliefs to keep her in his graces, while trying to convince him that the parts of his beliefs that Sockness planted into his mind were invalid, representing time and effort going into enabling. As you may have guessed by now, this is a very sad situation to find yourself in. You are fighting endlessly over the same weirdo who does not care or know that people are fighting over him, and you are putting yourself at risk of becoming massive troll bait yourself by doing it. You won't be able to influence Chris forever. Chris's fantasy beliefs getting validated just leaves an opening for others to eventually use down the line to manipulate him. An example is how a wave of copycats sprang in the wake of the ousting of the Idea Guys, with several successful adapting their tactics to circumvent their efforts of the guard dogs to prevent Chris. A related example is MKR Nightv, who took a page from the Idea Guys playbook, pretending to be a CPU goddess to align herself with Chris's beliefs. MKR Nightv claimed the charade was for helping Chris. However, by feeding into his delusions, she made it easier for others like Jacob Sockness to tap into Chris's beliefs to manipulate him in another direction. You will always be assumed to be acting in bad faith, regardless of your motives. Due to how many White Knights and Weeds have been using the same technique of playing along with Chris's fantasies, it has become much more difficult for Chris to determine if someone's been messing with him, or if they're genuinely trying to help him. Due to his continued facade of kindness towards other people, he will of course always go for believing them first until they betray him, which is rather sooner than later in most cases. Therefore, enablers are always placed on the same level of people like A-Logs and Weens by Christorians, and are readily assumed to be acting in bad faith, no matter what they intend to do with Chris. The confidence built by playing make-believe with Chris has been abused several times, and made people complete laughingstocks on the internet as a result. Sarah and Steve, multi-dimensional White Knights, and Jacob Sockness would all get their foot in the door by affirming Chris's beliefs, in some instances pretending to be channel fictional characters from other dimensions, and then betray that trust for their own entertainment. Onlookers from Kiwi Farms and the Quickie itself have watched White Knights reveal themselves in fact to be Weeds many times before. The Quick community at large treats Weeds without mercy. Even if you are not like the many traitors in recent Christery, it is impossible to get through to Chris any longer without deceiving him, and such guile is not looked upon favourably. Others have poisoned it the well before you. You will be assumed to be acting in bad faith if you try to influence Chris for any reason whatever, and treated accordingly. If you fail hard enough, you will be laughed at by the internet. At one point or another, you will be caught in the act, and you are going to have to spill the beans on your elaborative trolling scheme. Before you can even do so, however, someone is likely going to stumble across some really embarrassing information about you when they are trying to track down your motives. Remember, if you enable Chris, you will be assumed to be acting in bad faith. So the last thing you would want to do is show off, especially when others tell you to stop. Most enablers do not appear to be aware of the dire consequences of sharing their brilliant plans on various sites that either target Chris or ones he regularly uses, and they thus become the site's laughingstock of the month, just by skipping this caveat in their plans. An infamous example of this is the failed trolling plan of Sarah and Steve. Sarah first got the attention of Chris by asking for a Rosedew medallion, which Chris undoubtedly agreed to after they bribed him with a Nintendo Switch. Sarah then told Chris that she and Steve would move out to Virginia to be his only friends to help him out by giving him endless gifts and playing pretend with him as a means of further deluding Chris. This has brought them negative attention from trolls, even more so when they made a rise up and they tried to get themselves noticed by other prominent enablers to be declared King of the Weens. Doesn't that just roll off the tongue? A more infamous example would be Jacob Sockness, an amateur sorcerer from San Francisco, who pretended to be sexually attracted to Chris. When he was discovered by Kiwi Farms in 2018, he became one of the site's most popular topics of discussion due to his many absurd obsessions and mannerisms. He too had a lot in common with Chris, being autistic, receiving a monthly tugboat, and believing to possess magical powers. Miss Cherry had also proven herself to be a target of ridicule after he had posted an inactive thread about him on the Kiwi Farms, just so he could leak his trolling plan and show off. The farms naturally did not approve of this, and were not reluctant to dox him. This was made worse when he decided to double down and continuously talk about how internet famous all of this would make him. So next time you attempt to troll Chris through enabling, always remember that you are at great risk of being a target of ridicule yourself. If you're successful enough, it can come off as just as plain depraved. Out of the 4 groups represented in the Unholy Tetrad, enablers are arguably be considered some of the worst in many cases. Just like with A-logging and carpet bagging, the biggest reason of all for why you should not enable Chris with malicious intents in mind is for the legal liability. For some enablers, enabling Chris is more than just a game to mess with his comics. It can get to the point where they realize they can use his gullibility as a tool to do such malicious things to himself. Some can even tell him to go as far as to telling him to commit abuse to both himself and to other people, as well as extort money from him. If this is to show you anything about enabling Chris with the intent of trolling him, it is that if you go far enough with this practice, you will become the villain, rather than the funniest guy in the chat room. Money given to Chris will not help sustain him. After reading the above, you might realize that role-playing with Chris will not place you on the trolling honor roll anytime soon. Yet you might still wish to help him, and consider some kind of monetary contribution instead. This is also a bad idea. Up until August 2021, Chris was adequately housed and fed, even if both leave much to be desired, and his monthly tugboat from the United States government provided him and his mother with necessary financial support enough that he, in fact, used to make more money doing absolutely nothing than the average household worldwide gets for an entire family's labour. He certainly was not destitute. Chris's relationship with money is unhealthy. While he has not got himself into as much of a bind as Barb has, he lacks the forethought to save money for the future and attend to his financial affairs in a responsible way. He often spends his money on frivolities and then turns to his fanbase to pay for necessary expenses that he could have covered himself and he not squandered away his money. While concerns for what will become of Chris after his mother passes are legitimate, Chris evidently shows no concern for planning for his future when Bob is no longer with him. And any money that you give him now to help him secure his future will be frittered away on My Little Pony merchandise or video. Giving him more money now just teaches us that he is free to live beyond his means without a shred of responsibility, because people like you will be happy to foot the bill. Your money will be wasted in Chris's hands and is best kept out of them. As of November 2021, Chris is currently being held at the Central Virginia Regional Jail and is currently awaiting trial for the charge of incest. Arguably, jail food provides as much food needed improvement to his regular diet. As such, spending money to his inmate account would likely be spent in nothing but junk food from the commissary. Now, I know that probably this article would need to be updated, but as of June 2024, Chris is in Lynchburg. No, he's in Lynchburg, Virginia, and he seems to get an undisclosed amount. For it can be argued that after this whole affair, Chris is basically trying to stay on his best behavior. But it is also unclear about just how much he is receiving in terms of his depleted tugboat and what exactly he is spending his money on now that his Patreon is no longer fitting the bill as either. And finally, it's just not worth it. Seriously, don't even bother playing pretend with Chris at this point. At the end of the day, he's a seriously mentally ill individual in his 40s. And is in dire need of assistance from professionals. No matter what zany scheme you can come up with in an attempt to bring back the good old days, the fact of the matter is that attempting to feed Chris's delusions is a bad idea. Those days have long since passed as Chris progressively deteriorates. Playing into his psychosis to help him invent new ways to humiliate himself and become increasingly deluded about his place in the universe solely for your entertainment is not something that should be encouraged at this stage in his life. Likewise, it's repeatedly been established that the vast majority of attempts by trolls to trick him into proving himself in the long run have ended up being futile at best and damaging at worst. At this point, it appears that Chris is the only person who can seriously work at fixing his life. And tragically enough, he seems to be more comfortable living in his room or living in his own little world than rethinking his life to ensure a stable future. Realistically, something that I could just about say from the very beginning, but let's be completely real, ladies and gentlemen. I know that, and you know that. That's one of the saddest parts about this whole story, is the fact that if Chris didn't have anybody who was willing to pay through sympathy or pay for services that they know that Chris historically would have issues in fulfilling, Chris would have been shit out of luck and he would have been on the streets years ago. Chris doesn't seem to understand any of that for how it sounds and has continued to act very much the same as before, with no real recourse and no real happenstance for the things he should have learned or the things he should have taken upon himself. I can at least say, just to end this, here is the world that awaits you if you decide to make all the wrong choices. And with all that being said and done, I hope to see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.